Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1290. 1292. Okay. So to sum up what we've learned so far and the flow, let's go to the flow. So the last subject we're learning is Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov, how the enemies of the divine, of God, are eliminated or vanquished. And the connection to the whole discussion is the idea of Gvura, which is ultimately the goal of Gvura could be, well, Gvura can manifest in the worst possible way. Gvura is cautious, the severe judgments, the severe judgments and negative energies. But our goal is to ultimately transform that into the intensity of Gvura in holiness, where you have an intense love, not just a regular love. So in explaining that, the Rebbe Rashab, in explaining Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov, explained that you have the forces that are judgments, even if they're judgments of Kedusha, coming to challenge the compassion of God. They in turn evolve into the Gvuras Koshes of the Satan and Esav, that refer to, that are like compared to below, to the sadistic and cruel nature of certain individuals. That intention is only cruelty, nothing good about it. And yet they have the power to stand up against, and because of that, it awakens the Gvuras, even Gvuras Kadosh, holy judgments. So Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov is reaching a deeper place that reaches even higher, that's able to overcome that challenge. And that's reaching a place that's higher than Chesed and Gvura. It's reaching Atik, which is less Smela Bahaya Atika. It's higher than Chesed and Gvura. And from there, you're able to eliminate and even completely eliminate, first of all, silence and eliminate these Gvuras, the negative ones, whether they're coming from Kedusha or not coming from Kedusha. Because in either way, either case, it manifests in a Gvura, like we said about Rav Sheshes, that they gazed on someone and turned them into a pile of bones. So there's a negativity to that, even though it may be coming from a holy place. In that case, it is coming from a holy place. Then there's a higher level that is brought from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, where you're talking about the whole purpose is only tikkun, and not punishment, and not anger. And that comes from the level of Atik that's able to go deeper and higher. That's what we've learned so far, up to page. This is where we're at. A page. Keep listening to page 1292. Okay, and the connection to what we learned earlier, he made clear, is that when you're that when you're dealing with just want to see the yichud pnimi of Abba ve'ima. So we learned earlier that the cause for judgment is because there's the histalkus hameichin on Rosh Hashanah. There's a lack of the full mature intellect, so therefore there's room for judgment. Whereas when you draw down from Moichin Chadash and from Atik, you draw yichud pnimi of Abba ve'ima, which is even higher than Moichin the Gadlus on its own. And that's where it brings from Atik, and that's why it has this power. And that's where he explained also the difference between standing and sitting. So you sit in judgment because the king, using the example, when he's descending to judge his subjects, so he's not, as he's learning Torah on his own, or he's learning, or he's on his own using his moichin la'atzmei for himself. His moichin is now involved in chesed and gvura, schus and chayiv, merit and guilt of his subjects. So the moichin is going down to midas, like a person sitting where the head goes down goes lower from its upright state. The legs go higher when you're sitting as well, because then the he is not going down to actually governing his people in Biyah, it's above ground, because Nehi is also part of the sitting in judgment. That's the process. However, when he elevates to a higher level, then he rises even higher than when he's learning on his own. Because to go to battle, you have to stand up. What does the standing up signify? Rising? Like you said, Amadata. Or Emed Lariv Amim. The Amida signifies going even higher than Moichin, which is more like Gadlus HaMoichin, but it's Moichin higher than Midas. Now you're going to a place that Moichin goes to Atik, from where he goes the power to vanquish enemies and to fight a battle. So you need a full Amida that goes all the way up to the highest level and also goes down to the lowest level to win the battle. So the standing upright is that the feet go all the way down. They're not lifted like when one is sitting. And that is also part of this whole process that we learned in reaching the highest levels to bring it down all the way to the lowest levels. Now, the flow of all of this, just to remind ourselves how we've got into this whole thing is, Havaya goes back to page 1210, where the Rebbe Rashab first asked the questions. After that, he talked about Gan Eden and Elam Haba, which led us into the three levels of growth, Mutfa, Murgish, Muskel, and all the many other levels of how the development of transforming the human being, who begins on a very natural and behavioral and reflexive level, to becoming a person who thinks independently and goes beyond their own subjectivity all the way to the highest levels of Moichin as they unite with Atik. From there, you're able to draw down the highest levels and becomes the all-consuming love that we have, b'chol meidecha, ava b'chol meidecha, mesiris nefesh, ava b'tainugim, that all-consuming love, that God becomes your total experience, which is the ultimate, highest level possible to reach. From that, after he spoke about that, he said that has the power to transform, not just to bring down energy, but also to transform the very existence, to transform the Kalim into Kali itself. Should be like Ur. As you discussed, the mile of Kalim, the Kalim is even greater than Ur. And that brought us to the point where he brought on page 1287. That's why you have to have the Ava B'chol Meidecha. That brings us to that point of being higher than just the structural Ur that comes through mitzvahs, regular Torah mitzvahs, the Mem Tzadik Vav Hey, the name of Havaya, but to reach higher than Shmai, to reach who? And that you need to have b'chol ma'idecha that reaches all the way that higher level. The same thing with tshuva ma'ava, specifically through tshuva ma'ava, you also reach that level. That's why it transforms transgressions into merits. That was page 1287. And then he said, Ma'ata yuvan, and from now we will understand Havaya Yehcatu Merivov. So Havaya Yehcatu Merivov is coming as a continuation of transformation, not just elimination of the enemy, which we're going to learn about. Meanwhile, we've talked about the annihilation of the enemy. We haven't talked about the transformation yet, but we will talk about that as well. So that is the flow. That's the connection on page 1287, and now we're on 1292, 5 pages later. Yeah. Okay, so that's somewhat of a summary, and all of it is going to come to explain the Ein Oid that began the beginning of this volume 3, that not just you're drawing Havayu Elikim, the Eir into the Keli, that also Havaya is drawn even into the concealment of Elikim, but the actual concealment itself, you want that to be transformed. Like he's saying, the Rishimu, the Kelim themselves. That's a far deeper and higher level. Okay. Just want to see one thing before we continue. 1 second, please. And maybe if anybody wants to ask anything, now is a good time. While I want to look something up.
Did he say something about by yeshiva? There is also something which is a mishpat?
Yeshiv V'don, yeah. He sits and judges. That's what the Chazal say. The second 3 hours, Yeshiv V'don.
So what's the difference between, how is Yeshiv lower than Oimed if there is a done?
You're repeating the question I asked last class, and I gave what I thought was a satisfactory answer.
Would you
How
be
is it
able
different
to
than when he's Yeshiv and learning on his own?
Yeshiv and
you're asking?
Oimed? No, Yeshiv and Oimed, not learning on his own.
Oimed, he stands up to go to war. He's not sitting. He has to
But
rise.
Yeshiv, you also say it's a mishpat.
Mishpat, he's sitting. He's in judgment. It's Meichin going down to Midas. And Mulchama, Lariv is Amadata. He has to rise from his throne of judgment.
So Yeshiv is not Lariv.
Yeshiv is going, no, of course not. Yeshiv is sitting in judgment, Meichin going down to Chesed Gvura. Oimed is Meichin going up to Atik. This is what it says in the Maimer. I just suggested Friday to you, just read the Maimer without any interpretation. Just that's pshat of the Maimer. There's no explanation. That's what he says explicitly. Did you read it?
I understand what you said.
Read page 1291 and 1292. Just read it inside. He says it. This is what I just said is word for word from the Maimer. No explanation at all. Just read it slowly and patiently. You can read it after the class. You'll see it's very clear.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to just look up one thing. Any other questions? Okay. So what he said earlier, what I wanted to look up. When you reach this higher level of Gadlus HaMeichin, and even higher, when you're going and gazing at Arich, at the forehead of Arich and the drawing down from energy of Atik, you don't only have the power to harness and to channel the emotions, you actually transform the human emotions, become no longer subjective emotions, but they completely consume with the divine. This is a very important point, because I was always thinking the connection is ultimately that point. You begin as a human being that's subjective interests. That's a human emotion. A child, all it knows about is its needs. Slowly, you train the emotions of the child as the mind grows to start thinking about not just its own needs, but also to serve God. But it can still be on a very basic, like we said, nihi, on a basic, like a behavioral level. Then slowly the mind trains it. The mind begins to contemplate on God that's beyond your self-interest. Remember, we spoke about not just God as chayecha, your life and your sustenance, but also God beyond us, as we spoke from Tanya. And then that beyond, it goes even deeper when you get to Gadlus Abba, higher than Gadlus Bina, because Bina still connects with the Midas. And then ultimately the emotions themselves lead the person to start going even higher and looking at that's something that is beyond us and greater than us. Ultimately, the subjective self-interest of a human being is transformed to a subjective interest in the divine. Meaning the emotions now, all they care about is not my own life, it's about God, because they realize that God is the true reality. So it's not just your emotions were ignored, your subjectivity and your ego is ignored, and the mind takes over. The mind controls the heart. No, the heart itself is Ava v'Haftas Hashem L'kecha b'chol, not just b'chol levav b'chol ma'idecha. That all of you is totally consumed because you can't live without it, like he said. Negeya b'nafshe. And the mind itself begins to becoming more creative when it's negeya b'nefesh, when it's negeya to your very life. This is all part of that transformation. And that led us into ultimately where we are now, that the mitzvahs, that you need mitzvahs b'chol meidecha for this reason. Because mitzvahs alone will draw lakus, the godliness as it comes from Iris and Tekalim. That we learned. Mitzvah, Yud Kei Vav Kei, even the highest levels of Yud Kei Vav Kei. But when you want the Helam Ha'atzmi, something that is completely, you want to transform everything, transformation only happens when you are reaching the highest levels of Atik that's higher than Seder Shtalshlus, which is what we're discussing now in this discussion. But there's a lot more to go. So the topic is far from over. Okay. So we're going to continue now on page 1292, the new paragraph. I just want to remind you, because this is important to what we're going to learn now, back on page 1210, when he asked the questions, if you may recall, this is important, I just want to sum it up. He said there, we have to understand, he said, when it says, Havaya Yehcatu Merivov, haloi ga b'shem Havaya ksiv Havaya ish melchama. As we learned at the bottom of page 1290, that you say that God manifests Havaya ish melchama, a man of war. And it says melchama la'Hashem. Since in Havaya there's the concept of melchama, how can you say that from that same level comes the vanquishing of the enemy? If God is engaging in battle, that means there's something commensurate. Like we spoke here, like the Bnei Elikim have the ability with din to challenge judgment, challenging the compassion, the kindness of Havaya. So he said there, how's there melchama? So he says from the fact, it's mashma, it appears that the enemies, the opponents, are negative Havaya. So it's not understood. How could Havaya, since they're challenging Havaya, how could Havaya eliminate the challenge? So he said you have to therefore say that the name Havaya here is going to Havaya de La'ela. I'm reading from page 1210, a higher level of Havaya. And Havaya ish melchama is a lower level of Havaya. Havaya of Zah. And Havaya de La'ela is taka, that's the place where there's not shaykh melchama. Havaya de Zah, there you could say there's melchama. And that's the place, he says, actually, from there comes the power to cut off the enemy, and brings also Keser from the word Keser. Keser, the same letters as Chorus, to cutting off. It's all on page 1210, it's repeated on page 1291. Okay. And he said, we still have to understand what means the enemies of Havaya. He said that will be explained, and we've already learned that. But then he continues and says, according to this, in the future, the real Gili of Shem Havaya de Le'ela, which means the real Havaya Yehcatu Merivov, will be in the future. Not today, but in the future. And then he goes on to speak about Yitzchak. It's a 8 times Havaya, like the kinnur, like the harp, the lyre of 8 strings. 8 times Havaya. Kinnur is Chavav Ner. Chavav is Gematria Havaya. And the Beis Hamikdash was 7 times. Because 7 times, like Yaakov, is the Gematria 7 times Havaya. That's Havaya of Seder Shtalshlus. And Yemesha Mashiach, the Havaya de La'ela. And that will be the true transformation of eliminating the enemies. But then he asked the final question on page 1211. He said, so if that's the case, in the future, there'll be more than just eliminating the enemies. There'll be the transformation, epoch. That's higher. So why do we only say Yehcatu, which seems to be eliminate? And you say that goes on the future. Is it eliminating or is it transforming? I'm mentioning all of this because we're now going to enter this discussion. Is going to go further into this idea of Havaya Yehcatu Merivov. She says, well, now, according to the above, what we learned above, Mashakosov Havaya Yehcatu Merivov, Koyal Shem Havaya Dezah. That the enemies will be vanquished. The enemies is referring to Havaya of Zah. The Sham Shaykh in Merivov. Because there you can say there's an enemy. You could say there's Shaykh, possible battle. Like we asked the question before, how is it possible to stand up against God? The answer is this is Havaya of Zah, Havaya that relates to Melchama. The Kava Smail, there you could have Inyan Merivov, the Kava Smail, the Kav Yamin. That the left side, the Bnei Elikim, the judge, the forces of judgment can rise up stand up and oppose the forces of kindness. That gets stimulated and awakened through the gvuras kashis, like we learned, the harsh severities, and the level of bnei elikim, who are the standing in judgment. They're challenging chesed, imin. So based on that, Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov, who the Merivov? They're the Havaya of Shem Zoh, of Havaya de Zoh. Because there you have the actual structure of chesed and gvura, of right and left. Now, what level are you talking about here when you're speaking on this level? The hainu, and this means kishazohu bekatmus. You're talking about the emotions of Zoh that in a more diminished way. That's why there can be a challenge. You're not talking about Zoh begadlus, which you're reaching up, as we'll learn shortly, into the higher levels. It's Zoh bekatmus. U'kamosh is bar le'il, like we learned earlier, begimel madreges, in the three levels, the mutva, murgish, muskel, the three levels of mutva, which is the natural, the behavioral. Murgish, that we already have a sensation of feelings. Muskel, the cognitive emotions. The murgish who shamidas and kameshahen ba'atvar shalahem. That even murgish is when the muddas are still the way they're wired, their natural wiring. The gam sheyez b'zagili hamechin. That also when they're in a state where they have a cognitive element, remember emotions, let's say not of a newborn, but even of a 3-4-year-old, there is some cognitive, some awareness, some recognition, as we learned. The mind is at work. Even there, nevertheless, the emotions have not gotten out of their subjective wiring of their own self-interest. They're not sichlim, they haven't become cognitive emotions. They're not objective and reflective like the mind. They're not elevated to the level of seichel, which comes later in maturity. They're emotions, but they're emotions that the seichel is part of their process. That state of murgish feels and relates to emotions. We said murgish mitzad ha-seichel. Gam b'bchinas murgish mitzad ha-seichel. Even the murgish that is due to seichel. Let's say you tell a child, say thank you. When someone gives you something, say thank you. So the child understands. And that, in turn, when their murgish becomes driven by seichel, it's not purely their own self-interest that's driving it, but to say it's outside of the world of their self-interest and their natural emotions, it's also not. So that's a level of Zoh as it is in its location, not as it's elevated to the level of Moichin. It's only the Moichin that relates to Zoh, like we said, the Moichin that goes down to the level of Chesed and Gvura and guides it. Like we learned, Bina, Eim Revetzes ala Frechim, the mother that hovers over her fledglings, over her chicks. The Bina hovering over the emotions. So it's guiding the emotions to be intelligent ones. But he can't say the emotions have become the level of intellect, as we learned. So therefore, the Zoh is in a state of katnus. Even the murgish mitzad ha-seichel, afilu b'chinas primis ha-seichel. Like we learned, even if you're going from a deeper level of seichel, but it's still murgish mitzad ha-seichel. In other words, it's still as seichel is communicating to the level of emotions. Primis ha-seichel there was, I believe, bina. Aval ba'agdolas ha-zoh, but with the maturity and the growth and the development of emotions of Zoh Rampin, b'chinas muskel, in a level of muskel, the emotions now are ready to forego their own natural interest to experience something beyond themselves. Like the mind is introducing something beyond your own life and your own with the horizons and perspective. Shezeh b'chinas gadlus Abba, that's the maturity of Abba, Meichin. As it's higher, the mind, what does the mind do? It, especially Chachma, Abba, it opens you up to seeing a reality beyond yourself. When the midas are elevating and maturing and developing to that level, what happens? That's that higher level of Abba, Chachma, the maturity of Chachma, of wisdom, that is transmits into Zoh. What does it transmit? A deeper and inner understanding of something deeper and higher, a transcendent dimension. This is coming from the internal union the inner union of Chochmah and Bina as they relate to that which is higher than them. Arich and Atik. The Oz Hamidus Yetzim in Inyan Hatfa. When they're in that state, the emotions go out of their natural parameters, their natural wiring and structure, as they were embedded, as they were deeply, they were ingrained in us. The Hein Sichli Mamish. And the emotions now become Sichli Mamish. They literally become on the same level as a reflective mind that's experienced transcendence. Al Yedei Zeh Yehcatu Merivov. Through that, you eliminate the enemy. So in other words, initially, how could there be an enemy? Is because it's an enemy to Zah in its more immature state, in Katnus. So then, Chesed and Gvura could challenge Chesed. But once you go and mature to the level where Zah is being informed, it's called Gadlu Zah, being matured and reformed by Chochmah and Bina, then the Yichud Pnimi of Chochmah and Bina, then you have the power to eliminate these enemies.
Why is Yichud Pnimi Atik and Arich? It's Chochmah. How is it becoming Atik and Arich?
This I explained in the last few classes, and basically based on what we learned over the last 50 pages, he explained the Yichud Chitzeni. I refer you, go back to page 1236, I think. 1 second. Yeah. Go back to page 1236 and on. There he explained at length that there's Yichud Chitzeni of Chochmah and Bina, which relates more to the emotions, and Yichud Pnimi, which gazes up, like he said on top of page 1237, Zivuga Shlim, where mistaklim b'mitzcha da'arechampin umekablim misham shin ayin noheden of Atik. So there's moichin as it relates to emotions, and there's moichin that opens us up to transcendence, to an experience beyond us, which in Kabbalistic terms means it's gazing at the forehead of Arich, through which shines the energies, the 370 energies of Atik. Now, if you want details, I suggest you learn that. It's around 15 pages just about that topic. And I referred to it several times, and just that's the point there. So Yichud Pnimi Davo.
Thank you.
Are you taking questions?
Pnimi's, not really. I'm middle of learning. This was interjected, so I answered. So I'll let me finish the subject, and then I'll take questions. So because we're middle of an idea. So bottom line is, so what he's saying here is like this, that Havaya Yehcatu is going Havaya de Zah. That's why there could be a battle between, or an opponent of Gvura challenging Chesed, and that's Zah in a state of Katnus, and then comes the level that it matures and elevates, Yichud Pnimi of Abba Vima, and that's where you have the ability to overcome and vanquish that challenge. Commission is barely ill. Let me just finish the subject, and then we'll take questions. Like we learned earlier, the bottom of page 1287, B'Shem HaRamaz, in the name of the Ramaz on the Zohar. So there he brought from the Zohar, Zer Chele Gimel, Daf Tzadik Tes Amud Aleph, 99a. So he brought from the Ramaz, that what? The Hisedus Hadinim En Keshazo B'Chinas Yenika. The ability to stimulate, to awaken a challenge and prosecute, a prosecuting challenge against, is when Zah is in the form of Yenika. Like remember, Ibur Yenika Moichin. It's in the form of a diminished state. When what? By Rosh Hashanah, when the year ends, we said the Moichin are nostalgic. It's like in a state of sleep. Whenever there's sleep, when the so-called the defenses are lowered, that's when you're more vulnerable to challenge. That's why in Bnei Elikim Misyasiv Elikim, they stand up and rise up against the Chesed. They challenge the kindness, the voice of kindness of Havaya, in a state when Zah is in a form of Yenika, which is another way of saying Zah Katnus, of Zah, Chinas Katnus. Aval Kasher Nimshachem Meichen Chadoshim. But when when energies are driven by new Meichen, a new level, a new surge of cognitive energy coming from the highest levels, through the blowing and sounding of the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, mizbatlin kol adinim. all the judgments are eliminated. Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov. As we learned at the bottom of page 1287, as I just cited. So that's what he just said so far. Now, the subject is not over. Are we talking about Havaya of Zoh or Havaya de Le'elo, which we mentioned, which we'll talk about? That's what he's going to discuss as we go along here. So I'm happy to stop for questions now.
Yeah. So my question is more macroscopic. I'll speak in Balabatisha language, but it is directly related to this. I mean, it's this content.
You don't need to explain. Just take a question.
On the one hand, this sounds like a personal, individual struggle. The way that the Gvurus Kashus are overcome is by this individual struggle to rise to maturation, spiritual maturation, and develop our midos up to where they gaze upwards toward Amochin. Amochin draws from Arich Anpin and from ultimately this Shinaim Nahorim from Atik. You bring in this new these Nimshachim Mochin Chadashim down, and then you vanquish below. On the other hand, so that's an individual struggle. On the other hand, it says here comes Tia Shofar, and that's a macroscope that's happening. We're doing something. So
what's your question?
Well, the question is this an individual struggle, or it says Hashem Yehcatu Merivov? Is the Eibishter going to combat against Gvurus Kashus himself? I mean, or is it both? I mean, is it our individual struggle? It's all up to us, or is the Eibishter going to come and help us and have his midas chesed overcome the Gvurus Kashus?
Why can't it be a partnership? We do our effort, and God responds, like He said the whole time. It's always a partnership. When we blow shofar, so God responds with that additional strength. That's exactly, everything is that way.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's an interesting question. Can the Hashem Yehcatu Merivov without our individual effort? I mean, is that a natural process?
It's another discussion. I mean, I would wait till we finish the whole subject before we get to that, because this Rebbe Rashab is going to talk about all of this. At the end of the day, it's about everything is like that. If we don't have a hafta b'chol ma'idecha, will God do it for us? You know?
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. It's fair.
A person doesn't blow shofar, if a person is not fulfilling the mitzvah of blowing shofar in Rosh Hashanah, does he get the same hamshachas, the same extensions?
All right. Yeah, I guess it's not as weird of an issue as I thought. Yeah.
No, there's a thing called asusa delayla. The God initiates. There are times that we initiate, and then usually the best is when you have a combination of both. We do our part, and God responds. Like he said before, when we, I think he actually said that expression even. Where did he say? That when we go out of our comfort zone, then God goes out of his. We said that earlier as well. I think I spoke about it. Yeah, where a person does love without gvura, you could have love, regular love, then you have a love that's much more passionate. That also responds accordingly. I think he said that earlier on, maybe on page 1289. I'm just looking. Yeah. Okay.
But here the Rabbi Rashab is talking our individual efforts, our individual. This is how we can help vanquish the Gvurus Kashus is through this.
He's talking about everything here. I don't think he's just talking about individual efforts. He's talking about verses. He's talking about Rosh Hashanah. Let's be specific. Rosh Hashanah begins, and there's the possibility it's called the Day of Judgment. And yet through shofar, when we blow shofar, we invoke and evoke higher levels of moichin chadashim that comes to eliminate judgments. That's, if you want to put it in Balbatisha terms, that's Rosh Hashanah. So he's speaking about both.
Okay, thank you.
So Havaya Yehcatu Merivov is Zodi Le'elo. On Hashem Ish Milchama is Zodi L'Sato?
He didn't say anything like that yet. I said he didn't finish the subject. He just began. So far he said that the fact that there's an opponent, you have to say it's Havaya of Zah. Why? Because that's where you have an opponent. And then there's Zah, there's a state of Zah, the Katnus. That's in the moment, that's where you have an opponent. And then there's Zah, the Gadlus, where the Moichin Chadoshim from Yichud Pnimi of Abba ve'Ima, mature Zah to the level beyond Mutva, to the level of Muskal, and that's when it vanquishes. So right now, yes, he's talking all Havaya and Zah, two levels, Zah de Katnus and Zah de Gadlus.
But he still didn't answer, how could it be from Atik Merivov? If you're talking about Zah de Gadlus.
No one ever said that in Atik there's Meriva. Where did you get such a question? There is no Meriva in Atik.
He said Havaya Yehcatu Merivov. So
he says Havaya de Zah. So he said there's Meriva because it's Zah. It's not Atik. Where do you see the word Atik here? It's because of Zah. Some Shayach in your Meriva. In Zah is possible.
But Zah de La'elo, he said it's coming.
There's no Zah de La'elo. You're talking about Zah, Gadlus Zah or Katnus Zah. He doesn't use the word Zah de La'elo. You're talking about Havaya de La'elo? You mean Havaya de La'elo?
Yes.
He didn't mention that here. He mentioned that on page 1210. And as I said, he'll discuss it later. I mentioned it because of the context. But right now, he's talking about Zah, where there's a battle, there's an opponent. In Zah de Katnus, that's where you can have an opponent, because that's where you have Yanika, as I just explained at length. And then you have a higher level through to Kir Shefer, where you draw down from Yichud, the Pnimi of Abba ve'Ima draws into Zah, and then you eliminate this opponent. That's what he said so far. Okay.
So it's not touching Atik.
Where do you see the word Atik here? He doesn't mention Atik. He mentions Yichud Pnimi Da'ava, that's going into Zah, that matures it to the point where you can eliminate the Gvuras. And we will learn further. You have to have patience. He's in the middle of a subject. This is going to go at least 10 more pages, if I recall correctly. Maybe a little less. But it's going, so we're going to discuss it more. We'll discuss it. So far, this is what he says so far. Be patient. He's going to talk about Atik. He's going to talk about Havaya de La'elo. But right now, he began with this. There's going to be higher levels. There will be higher levels than what we just learned. And yes, he did say earlier that ultimately you need Atik to vanquish, eliminate the Dinim and Gvuris. But right now, he's not mentioned Atik. Right now, he's mentioned Yichud Pnimi Avavo. But if you look earlier, look at Nishachim, he says that Yichud Pnimi Davo, Pnimi is Atzmus Ein Sof. If you go back to page 1236 that I referred to, he does bring Atik there. Ozmiz Vatlin. But right now, he doesn't mention it yet because first he's starting step by step here. Okay?
Yeah, thank you. But right now, the Yehcatu Merivov is Zah de La'elo, and Hashem is
There is no Zah de La'elo. There's no word Zah de La'elo. You're using a word that doesn't say here. Where are you getting the word? There's no Zah de La'elo. There's Katnu Zah and Gadlu Zah. Which one are you referring to?
Man, Yehcatu Merivov is Gadlu Zah, and Hashem is Melchama is Katnu Zah, right?
Yeah. Katnu Zah, yeah.
Okay.
So now he continues, he's going to add now a new thing. And this, I just wanted to mention that there's a mimer in Likutei Torah, Havaya Yehcatu Merivov, in, of all places, it's in Parshas, I believe Parshas Noseh. In Parsha Noseh, in Likutei Torah, there's a mimer called Havaya Yehcatu Merivov. It's from, the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe said it on Parshas Vayetze. Shabbos Parsha Vayetze Tov Kuf Samach Hey. So some of what we're learning is based on that mimer, especially the next piece that we're going to be learning now. So when you look at let me explain, before we continue, we have to talk about the Gershayim. There's a thing called the Taimei HaMikra. Taimei HaMikra is the sing song. It's called Trop in Yiddish. How we read the Torah, let's say on Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's read with a certain sing song, right? So you have the whole sing song of we have that that we're taught how to read the Trop. One of the Trop is Gershayim. Gershayim are two apostrophes above a letter, and you read it in an elevated way. Anybody knows Trop? How do you do a Gershayim?
Gershayim.
There you go. So on the word Havaya, in Yehcatu Merivov, it uses a Gershayim. So it's like an elevated Havaya. Now Havaya could be read in different types of timing. You know, there's Havaya, I think. Anyway, but bottom line here is that's what he's going to now explain. That Havaya Yehcatu Merivov, you read, when you read it in the Haftarah, in Shmuel, on the first day Rosh Hashanah, so you read Havaya as Rab Shlomo just read it. So you say Havaya like that, yeah. So he says V'zehu, what we just learned now, Sha'atam shal shem Havaya zeh b'Gershayim. The tam, which means the trop, the sing song. How do you say tam? The tune, the melody.
The notes, the cantillation.
The what?
The notes or cantillation.
Okay. The way it's read is with a Gershayim. Shetsurase, just like the Gershayim is an uplifting tone. Say it again, Rab Shlomo, Gershayim.
Gershayim.
Gershayim. Okay. So just like the tone is going upward, so he says also the shape of the Gershayim are two apostrophes, Shetsurase, B'bchinas skifa, klapa maila. They're both like rising upward. That's what apostrophes look like. You know, you have different punctuation. The punctuation of Gershayim are two rising so-called lines, apostrophes. Remember, skifa, we just learned before, is connected to amida, to rising, right? Zekif is rising instead of hashpala, not going down, but going up. So just like the tune goes up, so does the actual surah, the exactly shape of these cantillations, whatever they're called, these pronunciations is also going upward. V'hush beis kavim, the Gershayim consists of two lines, two like apostrophes. Shereisheim, the top of them, zakuf ve'ela, that the top of them goes up, is upright and goes upward.
Described exactly. The Rabbi Rashab is describing it exactly.
Exactly. Zakuf ve'ela lamaila. It's upright and is facing going upward. It's like lines going upward. That's what the Gershayim look like. They look like the Gershayim look a little like a quotation marks, but they're on top of the word.
And they are not straight. Quotation is frozen. The Gershayim,
right. They're not straight. They're like that. They're like an apostrophe. They're a little like a semicircle. The chen, and the same, just as their tzura is that way, he says v'chein hanegina. Also their tune, the sound, the Gershayim who based tenuas v'kelis. Shein b'derech aliyah l'mayla. They consist of two what do they call, not sections, two phrases, not phrases. What do you say when you say two cadences? Two movements and sounds that are going aliyah l'mayla. That's why I was asking you guys to say it. Gershayim. Gershayim. Yeah. So both the punctuation imagery and the actual sounds consists of two. So that's why they're two, because they're indicating a double type of two movements going upward. So now he's going to explain why. And that's
I just posted it to the WhatsApp thread in case anyone's curious what it looks like.
Oh, the actual image? Okay, good.
Yeah,
good.
just so people know what we're talking about. It has the punctuation mark as well as cantillation, so people want to look at the second one, the cantillation mark above the letter.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Urdu. Okay, Gershayim. Good. Very good. So now that this, as I said, based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, he's going to explain what are these two aliyahs. So he's going to go now into two aliyahs of that are going to lead to Havaya Yehcatu. So he's going to say like this. And this indicates vehein, and this double aliyah, both in the tzura, the cantillation marks, and the sound, Ayin Beis aliyas, aliyah achar aliyah. It's referring to two elevations, one higher than the next. And what are these two aliyahs? V'hainu aliyah hazah b'bchinas arich v'atik. One second. Is he saying b'chinas arich v'atik b'chinas primus hakeser? Yeah. The first aliyah is zah, elevating in the level of arich and atik b'bchinas primus hakeser, which is the inner dimension of keser, most likely referring to atik. That's the first aliyah. And the second aliyah he's going to say on the next page, on the sixth line of the next page is going to go to aliyah habeis. So right now he's going to discuss the first elevation. The hidden is barely ill because it was explained earlier, and now you'll see now the whole subject coming together. In order for there to be the inner union of Chachma and Bina, that both of them, remember, Chachma and Bina standing at the same stature, not Bina the mother as it goes down to her children. What we're talking about, Bina and the father and mother standing side by side, ponim b'ponim, in an intimate union. So we learned that in order for there to be yichud primi d'aba v'ima, shezeu ma'atzmus erein sof, which means that this is coming from atzmus erein sof. Hadizeh alidei aliyas hazah shalamayla gamken lebchinas chachma bina. Shamayla gamken. I'm sorry. How do you get to that place? That's through the aliyah of zah. That zah is elevating. Shamayla gamken lebchinas chachma bina. Zah is also elevating to that level. Like we learned earlier. I'm going back now, page 1236. He says it explicitly, and especially in 1237 and on. Yeah.
Is this where the midos help elevate mochin? The passion of the midos? Yeah.
Well, when the midos mature, so they help elevate the mochin. But there's two parts here. First is that the yichud pnimi of Abba ve'ima, which is coming from atzmus erein sof. In order for there to be that yichud pnimi, you need to have that zah. It elevates, can't remain in an immature state. Because as long as the zah is an immature state, then it needs bina, its mother, to take care of it and guide it. Because it's still in a subjective state of self-interest. It's when the midas become emotional, shalach to shalach hasa'im, that means they send away the mother. The midas themselves say to the mother, you can now elevate back to the father, Abba ve'ima, but the midas themselves have become elevated, Aliyas hazah, shamayla gamken lebchinas chachma bina. That also gets elevated to chachma bina, like we said, zah, gadlu zah becomes sichlim. It's now matured. And that is what causes the yichud primi of Abba ve'ima. Shezein ha'oves, heina markove, shamaylim es b'chinas chabad l'sharshem hakodum. That's the oves, which are their makove. They're makove to what? Chesed, gvura, teferes. The oves. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they're completely a Merkava, meaning complete shari, complete bittul. And they elevate Chabad like a Merkava does. What does a chariot do? It elevates those that are riding in the chariot. So it elevates Chabad. And this we learned earlier. I'll refer you right here to the page. He said that explicitly right over here. 1 second. That was at the bottom. Yeah, bottom of page 1242. So he said, Magbim es amechin there. Bottom of page 1242. So now we're on top of page 1293. Uba Avoda, and what is this in Avoda? This is the first aliyah. Uba Avoda b'chinas ava de b'chol meidecha. This is the ava with all your might, with all of you. Shem b'chinas pnimi bina. This is the ava b'chol meidecha that comes from the inner dimension of bina that we learned about. Let me refer you now the two levels of bina of ava b'chol meidecha. Page 1247, and then 1247. Um, 1245 all the way through 1247. We talked about two levels of Ava B'chol Meidecha. The Hainu B'chinas Amkus HaSeichel. He's come to a place of the depth of his mind. She'oz hi b'chinas Ava Pnimis V'atzmis. Then he comes to an Ava Pnimis V'atzmis. An inner and core love. B'chinas Yechida Shebenefesh. Remember that his whole being, the level of Yechida Shebenefesh, V'yadua the B'chinas Yechida, L'maylo B'chinas Keser. Yechida above is the level of Keser. Balkain, and therefore Nasa Aliyah, therefore through this becomes Aliyah Sazah, the elevation of Zah, V'chochma Bina and Chochma Bina, B'chinas Primis HaKeser. So this is the first Aliyah. The Aliyah of Zah, which in turn elevates Chochma Bina and all of them at the Primis HaKeser, that everything, the emotions and the mind are all consumed with this inner deep passion to God, which is Primis HaKeser. So that's the first aliyah of Katnu Zah to Gadlu Zah, to the point that we just learned that Zah, all the way back to Chachma Bina, Yichud Pnimi Eloin, Yichud Pnimi of Chachma Bina.
Is this Chassidus? You're talking in the level of, because it says Makava, I always think lower, but I'm not sure.
Makava is not Atzilus. The Avis are Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. Everything here is not Atzilus. Whenever you talk about Zah or Keser, unless indicated otherwise, it's talking about Atzilus. Now, if you may recall, back there, he spoke about two levels on 1245. He spoke about, he's relying a lot that we remember what we learned. So some of this may need refreshing going back to the pages earlier. So he says like this. If you go back to page 1245, he says there's two levels in Ava B'chol Meidecha. One is Bina, which is Primis HaNefesh, not Atzmis HaNefesh. And then comes a Madrega Beis, is Ava Atzmis Mamish, the higher level in Ava B'chol Meidecha. He's going to refer to these two levels now. That's why I'm mentioning it. Yeah. One minute. Yeah. So he says like this now. According to what it says in Eitz Chaim, gate 41, chapter 3, Yechida hi b'chinas arich. Yechida is the level of arich. Ubeteichi yesh nitzutz koten dugmas b'chinas atik. And within it, there's a small spark, which is similar to the level of atik. So this is brought in my Morim in Basel Legani. The Rabbi actually in the early has a footnote that talks about Yichud and Nikud. He talks about the Nitzutz Kotten of Elikus, which goes into Yechida. So Yechida Shebenefesh, even though it's the highest level in the Nefesh, there's also a higher level. because Yechida is still one of the 5 names that the soul is called. So there's the Etzem and Hashem even higher than Yechida. So he's saying Yechida is Arich, and within it there's a spark that's similar to Atik. And the Rebbe Rashab is Mechadish v'yesh leimer the Beizei Fanim shen is bar leil ba'avad b'chol meidecha. The 2 ways he explained earlier, Ava b'chol meidecha on page 1246 that I just referred to. Is he says Yashleimer Hem B'chinas Arich v'Atik. That's the level of Arich and Atik. Now, this may not make much difference to you because you have to go back to the Maimarim there, what we learned earlier. But on page 1246 was a very fundamental piece of where we finally reach the level where your emotional subjectivity. And maybe I should just elaborate a bit more. As I said, the human being, by definition, by nature, we are subjective creatures. Adam karev eitzel atzmai, there's an expression. Persons close to themselves. That means that you will avas atzmai. We always love ourselves more than we love anyone else, which presents a challenge, because when you love yourself more than anyone else, that can easily lead to overlooking or ignoring another person's needs, or worse, that you become selfish and take something that doesn't belong to you. And even worse, that can lead to all hostilities, injustices, and ultimately battles and wars. If there was no such thing as self-interest, and the human being was a complete selfless creature, we wouldn't have any of that. But that's how God created us. That's how we are. That's our emotions are wired that way. Now, many schools of psychology will argue that you really can never change that. That's who you are. We're ultimately selfish creatures. Richard Dawkins has a book called The Selfish Gene. Even the very gene is selfish. It's not even by choice. It's who we are, survival of the fittest. If you take it to the farthest conclusion, logical conclusion, it's really very much a Darwinian, Freudian model that is very much about self. The self drives everything, which is really the prevalent view of evolutionary biologists today. So the idea that a person can have self-control and be expected to not be selfish, for many, is really just behavioral at best. There are laws that deter that if you do pass a red light, even though your interest may be you want to get faster, so you're going to pass a red light, so you'll get a ticket. But green lights and red lights are only there for convenience to coexist, but there's nothing inherent about it. Left to your own, a person would do whatever they want, and they would not have it. In Freud's words, the ego and the superego are superimposed over the id, which is just a natural wild animal interested in its own pleasure and sexual pleasure and so on. Now, it's of course a depressing view on the human race, but it's a very common view. The only reason you don't prosecute a predator in the wild for killing the prey, because we say animals have no control. You're going to go prosecute a leopard for killing a fawn, a deer? No. So why by human beings do we prosecute? Because for some reason we expect more from ourselves, and we know that people could exercise self-control. You don't have to go murder another person and cannibalize them to have a meal. But it's still difficult fully to justify if you take the very raw and hardcore Freudian model. You could say, 1 second, maybe we're just like animals in the wild. I'm not going to go now and explain that. From the Torah point of view, the very opposite is true. You were created b'tselem Elokim. You created the divine image. And yes, God gave in you in Parshaneach, Yetzer Leva Adam Ramin Urav, a second Yetzer Hara, it's called the evil inclination, in Tanya, an animal soul, that battles with your divine soul. But there's an equal battle here. It's not that you're driven by self-interest and the animal soul is always going to dominate. The fact that it dominates so often is only simply because it's easier. It's more natural to us. But we absolutely believe that, first of all, the Nefesh Elikis can be wiser and can control and harness and guide the animal soul. Secondly, they can actually even train the animal soul that the animal soul should also go along and in its self-interest also become more refined to the point you can actually transform it. Now, all of Chassidus, all of Torah would simply be eliminated if we didn't believe a human being could be more than an animal. Why would we have all these very refined mitzvahs that are more than just control your temptations and your desires? We're talking about very high-level mitzvahs. Know God, love God. If the Torah only included, don't be an animal, don't murder, don't violate somebody, don't steal, then you could say, okay, the Torah expects from us to at least have some form of decency or civility. But the mitzvahs of the Torah talk about much higher levels. And especially when you bring Kabbalah, and especially Chassidus, we're not just expected not to be animals, we're expected to be more than human, to become divine. So the whole premise of everything we're learning is based on, you have to say, another perspective on human nature. Because there's no way you can see the human as a fundamental animal and expect them to reach, let alone, forget about muskal. Even that midas should be somewhat controlled. Yes, you can control it behaviorally at best. But for it to be transformed to levels that we're describing here, that your whole passion and your emotional subjectivity is only consumed with God, that it has replaced your own self-interest, and now your self-interest is not you, but something greater than you, and that too becomes who you are. That could only be based on a model that the human being is not wired just to be an animal. There is an aspect of us. No one denies that Nefesh Habamis is very powerful. The Alter Rebbe says clearly you cannot destroy your Nefesh Habamis. As a matter of fact, Beinoni is what's expected, to control it. But here we're talking about levels even higher than that. We're talking about transformation. So this type of transformation is predicated on the fact that you can reach such levels. They're very high levels. Don't get me wrong. I don't say, but if we finish this shiur today, that now we are suddenly all free, scot-free. We still have to contend with the animal soul. But at least he's talking about aspiring to such highest levels. So that's why it's critical to understand what we're talking about here. That's why he's saying now, so going back, bring it back. And I just spoke in psychological terms, in Chassidus applied terms, if you wish. But when it comes back in language of the Maimer here, Katnuzah is the emotions as they are on their own, but they're being guided by the Seichel. Gadluzah is the emotions have matured, that the mind has educated them, that your interest should be something transcendent, something permanent, instead of pursuing the impermanence of material life, to pursue something that is eternal. And that's also your interest. To the point that the midas, Gadluzah, elevate. And elevate, they get elevated, and they in turn elevate the mind itself to even higher levels. What he's calling here, Primis Bina, Ava Primis Atzmus, Bechinis Yechidah Shebenefesh. And that too, we just spoke about two levels. One is Yechidah, and one is the Nitzutz of Atik, which is even the higher level of Ava B'chol Moedecha. And this is so not just Ava B'chol Levavcha, which is B'shnei Yitzarecha, loving God with both sides. And not just B'chol Nafshecha, which he says with all our faculties, back on page 1246. But even Ava B'chol Meidecha, that all of you is completely consumed. It's Negei B'nefesh. You can't live without God, godliness. And this too has two levels, like we said, Arich and Atik. V'zehu ha'aliyah ha'alef, the Havaya Dezah.
So Atik means...
I will take questions when I finish the subject. We're all here together. Just be patient. V'zehu aliyah alef, the Havaya Dezah. This is the first elevation of Havaya Dezah, oile b'bchinis primis hakeser. That it goes all the way up to primis hakeser, all-consuming love of the divine that we just learned about. Yechidah and even higher. That's the first aliyah of the Gershayim on the word Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov, on the word Havaya. Yeah, what do you want to ask?
Hello, could you hear me?
I hear you.
Is Yechidah Arich And the nekudo pnimis
Why
in
don't you, let's read inside together. He says, Yechide b'chinas arich. So that answers your first question, right?
Yeah.
Ubetoiche yesh nitzuz kotten dugmas b'chinas atik.
This is a new concept to me. It doesn't mean anything. Okay, but that there is
Okay,
something.
so listen. So that means you have a bright future ahead of you. There's more things to learn. What do you think about that?
Okay. But
We
you
didn't
know
read-
what? Possibly
I said I
that
didn't know
in
it, but,
Yechida there is a Havaya.
well, we always know Yechida is a level, but I just said Chamisha. You never heard before Chamisha Shem is Nikra law, and Yechida is only still a shame, and law is
Right.
even higher than Yechida.
Okay.
Did you hear that ever?
This year, but now it's something that there is a nekuda pnimis in the Yechida.
That's the that's the Nitzutz Cotton. Look in the Rebbe's Ha'ara in Basiligani, Tavshin Yud. The Rebbe brings it in Ha'ara, he explains it. Okay. So this is the first Aliyah. Now comes the second Aliyah. The Gershayim remembers two. Aliyah after an Aliyah. Goes up. This is Aliyah HaBeis, and the second Aliyah Shebetam the Gershayim in the tam, in the sound, or the cantonate, whatever they're called, Gershayim, goes even higher now. Who, and that is Shagam B'chinas Pnimis HaKeser, that also Pnimis HaKeser, Oila, elevates B'chinas Atzmus Eid Ein Sof. Hainu B'chinas Malchus the Ein Sof K'may Shu Lifnei HaTzimtzum. So now we're going to beyond Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. We're going out Pre-Tzimtzum. Remember, Atzilus the Klolos. So the Pnimis HaKeser goes to Atzmus Eid Ein Sof, the core of Eid Ein Sof, which is Malchus the Ein Sof, the end or the lowest level, Lifnei HaTzimtzum. U'kamoshe kosev ba'abir de v'nigdashti, like he explains in the Kutateit in the Bir of V'nigdashti, which was cited before on page 1236, which I've referred to a number of times. What did he say there? What does he say there? So if you go back to 1236, you'll see it. Be'inyan yichud da Abba ve'ima, about the union of Chachma and Bina, Abba ve'ima, father and mother. Shezeu masha Abba ve'ima, he explains there, mekablim mekeser, they, Abba ve'ima receives from Keser, that's like the first aliyah. The Keser ma'atik, and Keser receives from atik, Keser here being like arich. Uma'ad ein sof ha'maitzil elyon, to the point all the way to the ein sof, the infinite, of the supernal emanator, maitzil, not just netzal, not just Keser and pnimis Keser, but even higher, ki hu levade b'keichi lechadish dover, because he alone has the power to create something new. So when Yichud Pnimi of Chachma and Bina create new energy, they're not doing it on their own. They're doing it because they're accessing and drawing down from, like he says, from Keser from Atik till Pnimis, till Ein Sof HaMaitzil Elyon, because he's the only one that has the power to really create something Chadash Dover. And like we learned before, in order for there to be the elimination and the annihilation of all the prosecutors and all the complainers, that is when it's drawing down from the infinite divine light, Pre-Tzimtzum, as we learned at length before. So that's the second aliyah now. It's not just the aliyah from Zoh, Chachma Bina, Abba Ve'ima to Keser, all the way to Atik, but even previous Keser, going all the way up to Lifnei HaTzimtzum. And this is going to connect it soon to Hu and Shmoi, because remember, Lifnei HaTzimtzum itself, we have two levels. Shmoi is Havaya, mitzvahs, Torah and mitzvahs, and Hu is the Helema Atzmi that comes from the deepest levels of Gvura that we're going to be learning about. This is how it's all coming around, coming together now. Okay, so like it says elsewhere in the Maimer called Kitapuach, I think this is a Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, but I have to look up which Maimer, I'm not sure. It's a famous Maimer, Kitapuach Ba'atzayar, yeah. What does he say there? The Bnei Elikim. Remember, the children of Elikim are the angels, the prosecuting angels of Kedusha that challenge Chesed. Yes, 19
now.
Oh, okay. Well, from urgent care.
Yeah.
Change the medicine to Catholics.
Then change the medicine?
He changed it.
Can you silence yourself?
Rabbi Teitel, you have to silence yourself. Rabbi Teitel, we hear your conversation. You have to mute.
Thank you.
So what does he say there? The Bnei Elikim Yeshlem Sherish b'Bchinas HaTzimtzum, B'Chinas Tzimtzum Arishin. That they have a root in the Tzimtzum Arishin because they come from Gvura. Tzimtzum is din, concealment. Like that's what it says elsewhere. V'nisker gam ken le'el, and was also mentioned above. The B'chinas HaTzimtzum liyeseh B'chinas Gvura, that the level of Tzimtzum being that it's a state of Gvura, Gvura meaning like concealment and helam, v'hainu Gvuras b'peil lahaylim ulahastir, which means not just the power of Gvura, but actual Gvura, to conceal and cover up, u'kamaymer geil le'er mipnei cheshech, that he rolls back oir, due to the cheshech basically is covering up the oir geil le'er, behechlich sheyiyeh b'chinas hapselis. That the tzimtzum, due to the fact that it's gvura, you have to say that there'll be some waste, some residue will remain from it, because whenever you conceal, like we learned earlier, something comes of it that can evolve and become something negative. Like we spoke about, if the father conceals himself from his child, the whole intention is the child should find the father. But nevertheless, the very concealment can lead to a distortion, that you think the father is not there or someone else doesn't understand. Concealment in general, even though it's necessary, leads to problems. Can definitely lead to problems, and very often does lead to problems. And that was the world of Toyu, or the inyan of Toyu, Shezeu Hafrodas Hapselis. That was the purpose of the world of Toyu, Hafrodas Hapselis, to separate the waste that is a result from the Gvura of the Tzimtzum. I don't know if any of you heard my class last Thursday, in the Kollel, so I spoke about this at length. So when you have a situation where there's a dissonance between energy and container, after the tzimtzum, however you twist and turn it, even though there can't be an existence without the tzimtzum, but since there's a tzimtzum, what happened? Godliness, which was a given, suddenly became a novelty. Elokuz b'pshitus, godliness was a given. And elam is b'schachus, the world was a novelty. The tzimtzum reversed things, turned the glove inside out, and suddenly the glove can be more important than the hand inside it. The klipa, the husk, the shell could be more important than the fruit inside it. So yes, there's a goal. The intention is to create independent consciousness and to create the ability for us to exist, to be able to do our avodah, make a dira b'tachtenim. But there's a side effect. There's always going to be a side effect. The side effect is a distortion. So you need to correct the distortion. And Toyu comes, the shattering of the containers actually come to correct the market correction that there's something wrong in order to repair it, create tikkun. So Afrodas Hapselis. So there's this V'achakach b'shviras hakelim nisarev Hapselis ba'atev. And by the containers breaking, shattering, there's a mix of the pselis and the tev, and it's araveda by the atikum u'mayla. and through the tikkun from milmaila, from above, I'm going to have to explain all this. I'll do that shortly. So then comes the tikkun milmaila. What means milmaila? There's a strength coming from Shema HaChodesh, which comes from ak. That through that repair has the power to repair, gives us the power to repair the broken shards and clarify and separate the good from the bad. The pseil is the waste from the good. And that's the building of the world of tikkun, the world of repair. And the ra becomes now separate and distinguished. To the point that also below, we have the capacity to separate the bad from the good. As it's known, the betchilas habriya, in the beginning of creation, the klippus, the husks, were lower than all the worlds. And there was a clear boundary that separated them and holiness. So the Arizal explains this in Taimei HaMitzvahs, which is a sefer called L'Kutei Torah of the Arizal in Bereshis, and below there's also printed the reasons for mitzvahs in Tchum Shabbos. By the Chetei Tzadas Chazru v'Nisarvu, the Chetei Tzadas joined them together like a snowball effect of good and bad. I'm going to explain all this momentarily. Let me just read it inside. That's why they were expelled from the Garden of Eden to go work the land, because now that it got mixed together, they have to work the land to separate them, the good from the evil. Levarer berurim, to clarify, ulahafri the sarah, ulahalas satev, to separate the dross, the waste, and to elevate the good. Nimtza. So what do we see from all this? The b'chinas bnei elikim, shashim b'chinas hagvura the tzimtzum addition, that the bnei elikim, which is rooted in the tzimtzum addition, the gvura of tzimtzum addition, ubayim li'syatzav al Havaya, and they come to challenge, stand up against Havaya, b'chinas gili hakav, that's the gili of the kav chesed. That's why we need something higher, because the tzimtzum and the kav are equal challenges. So you need amshach, something from pre-tzimtzum, and through that you eliminate all the prosecutors and all the dinim, all these challengers and prosecutors and complainants or complainers. Okay. Now I know this needs explanation. I'll just say it briefly and I'll try to explain it more at length tomorrow. So the bottom line, we discussed this, I think, at length in a few last week sometime. Whenever there's concealment, there's a possibility of a problem, as I mentioned. If the boss is revealed, when you see the boss and all the workers that see the boss, they're not going to cheat. They're not going to do anything wrong. But as soon as the boss is not there, even if he's looking and but they think he's not, there's always room for problems. The same thing, that Tzimtzum and the Gvura is indeed the divine power to conceal, but it has the ability to create not the ability, it creates a separate consciousness. Why on day 2 in creation doesn't say the word ki tov? God said it was good. God created day 2. He created and separated the heavens from the waters below, from the waters above. It's all God. There's no one else. So why doesn't it say tov? So the answer is because on that day was created diversity, and diversity has the possibility for division, for divisiveness, machlekes, and you can't say good when all you see is the separation. On day 3, you say a double good, because day 2 is also good, but it's concealed. So day 2, you can't say good because this separation is the first potential creation for war. Yes, there's no war yet actual, but as soon as you have 2 identities, 2 consciousness, which is what the Tzimtzum created, you have the potential for problems. Day 3 is the day of Shalom, Tiferes is created, vegetation, birth, and that we recognize that the purpose of day 2 was there should be a 3. Shnei ksuvim machishim zeh zeh. 2 verses that contradict each other. The purpose is to have the Keser Ashlishi, the 3rd verse that comes and reconciles, machriya beinayim. So the purpose of 2 is not that there should be a collision, that there should be harmony within diversity. But bottom line is, in day 1, chesed, you can say toiv, because it's revealed good, revealed unity. Day 2, because it's not revealed, you don't say good yet. Day 3, that's the kavanah tikkun. That's tikkun, atzilus, hiskalulus. But it doesn't come without a price, so to speak. So therefore, the very fact that there was a concealment of the tzimtzum ultimately led to a world of tayu. I'm not sure what he means. I think he means to say the purpose of it is to separate the waste. But bottom line is now the Shviras HaKelim create a chaos and confusion. 2nd verse in the Torah, darkness cover it all. So there's a confusion, because when anything is broken, like he says, nisad of apselas ba'atev, and then we need tikkun, which comes from a higher power that's even higher, the Shem HaMa'achodash, that gives the power to start separating. And that's the work we do here below. We come to separate the pselas, the waste, the materialism, from its spark of holiness that gives it energy, and direct it all toward godliness, and not have the fragmentation of a disjointed universe that's not aligned with its purpose. So going back now, so since the Bnei Elikim comes from Gvura and Din, are rooted in the Tzimtzum Arishon and Gvura and Din, they have the ability to challenge the chesed of the kav. Therefore, you need to access, just like on the first aliyah, you need to go to Pnimius HaKeser. That's higher, less smaila b'hayatika. That's higher than the kavim of chesed and Gvura to be able to create Havaya, Yehcatu, Merivov, to eliminate the prosecutors. So to here, you have to go to a level that's higher than the tzimtzum, that's higher and higher than the kav, obviously, to be able to eliminate the Bnei Elikim that challenge the chesed of the kav of Ur. That's briefly what he just said here. The Shem HaMa'achodesh, I want to leave to the next class. I'll explain a little more detail tomorrow. I'm going to stop here by the end of this paragraph on page 1293. Any questions?
It was an amazing explanation. Incredible. It almost sounds like a little bit of new creation when you exercise this level of I don't know, hisaros to rise up to godliness that so high, all the way up to get these new lights, this new energy to beat the Mekatri and the prosecutors and the worst cautious. It's almost like you're asking God to. We know He's not He's renewing each day the creation, but in a sense, it's almost like you're asking for a little bit more of extra creation when you go up there to give a little bit more elbow grease. The whole
of Chassidus is based on this principle that we are drawing down new energy from higher levels before the Tzimtzum as we transform the world. This isn't just this piece here. What you're touching upon is really the whole understanding. You said you were learning Samach Vav, right? In the beginning of Samach Vav, volume 1. I'm sorry, the first mimer. He talks about that it's not just enough to draw down the oil that was there before and was concealed, but we have to actually draw new energy. So essentially, the whole purpose of a person's avodah, as we've been learning at length, is oir chodosh, not just the energy that was there and was concealed, not just reclaiming and revisiting what was there in Gan Eden before the sin, but to actually draw oir chodosh from the highest levels that transforms this world, and that's really Geula is an oir chodosh. So that's the ultimate goal in general. Yes.
Amazing. Shkarach. I just wanted to point out before you stop the recording that in the Ayin Beis thread, I posted a couple other things. First of all, from Shmuel Shmuel Aleph pasuk base, Perek base pasuk. I think it's Yud. The Hashem Yehcatu Merivov. That's where the Gershayim is coming from. That's where you said you read Shem Havaya with the Gershayim. I wanted to point that out to people, and I put the pasuk beneath that. You can see it. It's amazing just how he's bringing that use of the Gershayim, Dafka, in the midst of explaining Hashem Yehcatu Merivov. That's what I posted, and then I also posted your lecture, your Shiur from last Thursday on Shvir Sakelim, just for people to know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the Rebbe reading the Haftarah without Havaya, but I at the time I wasn't aware of this beer, this explanation.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
I'll never read a Gershayim. I'll never read it the same ever again.
There you go. Okay. The
I
question
don't know how you could even read it when you know what you're saying over here. It's just like you know how the Alter Rebbe couldn't even say Havaya, Atzilus. Right. Here, I think you'd be stopped in your tracks when you start to say that.
Let's just say I'll never look at it the same way again.
No, let's put it this way. Once you internalize it, then when you read it, it has this whole deeper meaning. Can you imagine?
That's exactly what I'm saying. What a beautiful gift you gave us all today.
Well, thank the Rebbe Rashab.
Yeah, it's nice to know. I have your time.
What do they say? They say, the wine belongs to the owner. You say thank you to the waiter. I'm just the waiter here.
Shkoyach.
Okay, listen, he's going to tie it all together. The eloquence here is beyond words. The next paragraph is going to go back to Havaya Tata Le'ela Mitzvahs, bringing it all together and seeing how it all flows. Wow, pretty amazing. Just look at the next few lines, you'll see what I mean. Okay.
But I thought of what you said today about that when you didn't digress, but you said a very interesting, illuminating discussion about the selfish gene and so on. Really, isn't Ayin Beis going deeper and more bigger, deeper paradigm than even Tanya? Because Tanya says, as you said, Beinani, that we learn
apparently, yeah, I would agree. Yes.
Wow. This is talking about actually transforming it, the level of tzaddik, like David Melech, that he doesn't have a Yetzer Hara, no, he killed it.
There was the Alter Rebbe wrote a Sefer Shel Tzaddikim, but it got burned.
So maybe this is it.
It's very possible. He's definitely talking about higher level. He's talking. We know the Beinani is not. It doesn't transform the animal soul. He subdues it. You can direct it. You can guide it. You harness it. But this is definitely talking here. Remember, he's talking to us. Is ultimately the Allah Asad Lave is where everything gets transformed. The Tanya doesn't go into Mashiach's times. The Tanya is talking now. So it's clearly talking about here those highest levels. We'll see. He's going to go back to this. When do we have this revelation? But he's definitely moving here to very, very high levels. I was always very moved by when the Rebbe Rashab, there's a book called the Shkafta the Rebbe, which means Shkafta the Rebbe means the Rebbe's last bed, basically his last resting place, which is a Shkafta is like it refers to, I don't want to say the word deathbed, but that's what it means. So Rabbi Beryl Rifkin, who was an assistant, he was like a shtub, what was he called? A shtub bacher. He was a student in the Rebbe Rashab's home. He wrote up, unbelievable, the Rebbe Rashab's last days, and he had typhus. It was feverish, it's very difficult, and very, very emotional. You can't stop crying when you read it. So there's one thing he says that in the middle of the night, I think it's the last night of his life. So the Rebbe Rashab was speaking. He had high fever, so he was speaking. And when you listen closely, he said these words. He said, "A neshama gate eis, a neshama expires, from the yichud, from das elyon and das tachten, from the joining of the higher divine perspective and the lower divine." Basically, themes of Ayin Beis, where there's the ultimate union of how we see existence through the eyes of God as He manifests in existence, and we see existence through the eyes of God that is beyond existence, and you join them together, which means Atzmus, we have them both, God and existence, and all beyond that. And that's what the Rebbe Rashab was saying in his sleep, in his fever. And when you think about it, like this is Ayin Beis, this would be Rebbe Rashab passes away in Tafresh Pei, 1920. We're probably now definitely in 1917, 18, maybe even 1919. You never know. He wrote this after 1916 because the second volume ends in the end of 1915, I should say. So this is further on, and he was living what he wrote. And when you read that, whenever I read that, it always comes back that he was reaching personally the highest possible levels one can humanly reach in the joining of God and existence. And there's no question he's going here far, far higher than the Tanya, for sure. Maybe later chapters in Tanya alludes to it, but definitely. I never would necessarily phrase it that way because Tanya is ultimately the Torah Shebiksav, and that's what we need to work with. But he's definitely bases this a lot on Tanya, but he's definitely taking it to the level where you're talking about emotions are now completely consumed with God. What's negay b'nefesh is only godliness. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Level Nun of Moshe Rabbeinu too.
Yeah.
The Rebbe Rashab said then, Ich gehe in Himmel und die Ksavim los ich euch. I am going in heaven, and the Ksavim, how would you write Ksavim?
The writings,
how would
the manuscripts, the writings.
I'm leaving you.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop here. The end